let's take a look at the basic functions of the respiratory system. The primary one, as you know, is gas exchange, bringing oxygen into the lungs and eventually into the blood and ultimately to the cells is the goal. And in a similar fashion, CO2 from the cells is taken to the blood and then to the lungs and then to the atmosphere. So that is done in a very sophisticated manner. We will explore these in different sections. Acid-base balance is yet another important function of the lungs. By regulating the breathing rate, we can control the amount of CO2 that we lose or retain. Okay, so how CO2 helps with the acid-base balance is where we need to talk about CO2 regulating hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, too much CO2 would lead to a buildup of hydrogen ion in the blood, and that would lead to acidic blood, correct? So by increasing the rate of breathing, hyperventilation, we could blow off this CO2. And the opposite is true when we need to correct the pH from the alkaline condition to normal normal pH condition. In there, we would have hypoventilation to retain CO2. That means keep more hydrogen ions to correct the basic pH situation. Phonation is the sound production. Larynx, the voice box with vocal cords, are the key structures here, but there are muscles within the pharynx as well as in the tongue that contribute to the production of sound. The production of sound is not all about speech. The words that we need to say is actually from an area within the brain called Wernicke's area. The synthesis of words happens here. Broca's area is the one that actually controls the motor parts that are associated with the sound, and that involves the vocal cords, the laryngeal muscles, the pharyngeal muscles, the tongue muscles, and so on. Olfaction happens to be a bonus within the respiratory system. Olfactory epithelium is in the roof of the nasal cavity. In this area, you have millions of bipolar neurons. These are special sensory neurons that detect different kinds of smell. We can differentiate thousands of different odors, and we will not be looking at the details of olfaction here. This is how much we talk about it. Now, defense. Yes, we need to be able to protect the body through the respiratory tract. Why? We have an opening to the exterior, the external nares. That means it's an easy access for the pathogens to make their way into the body. We have a few structures to defend against these pathogens. One is the mucus lining, which is constantly producing mucus. The old mucus is removed, new mucus is replaced, replacing the old mucus. All of that is good. When a pathogen makes its way into the respiratory tract, it gets trapped in the mucus. The texture of the mucus is such that it's slimy, slippery, and viscous, and there the pathogen is trapped, and phagocytic cells nearby would arrive and phagocytose and remove. If they survive this defense mechanism, we have special structures called tonsils. They form a ring around the pharynx, and there are lymphocytes, and they could bring about non-specific defense mechanisms. And yet another layer of protection is if mucus is swallowed, it goes next to the digestive tract, where we have acidic gastric juice, enzyme-rich intestinal juice to handle these pathogens. So basically, yeah, we do have easy access to them, but we do have some defense mechanism to protect against this setup. Now we have this basic layout of the respiratory tract. Lots of different parts. First, we'll get an overview of the names and a few details using this slide. Let's follow the passageway of air. Okay, we need to talk about external nares then. Those are the openings into the nasal cavity. Air moves in. Nasal cavity is where the space is called vestibule. It's not labeled here, but you have to imagine that space. And then once the air is inside, it has to bounce back and forth against these bony turbinates. Okay, this is all part of the ethmoid bone. And anyway, so here as the air circulates for a little bit of time, it gets heated. It gets filtered by the nasal hair. Then also mucus would humidify this air. All of that is great stuff. And this air now travels via the internal nares. These are the openings into the pharynx. Pharynx here is nothing but the space. Space next to the internal nares here would be referred to as the nasal pharynx. This portion of the pharynx is called oropharynx. Why? It's right next to the mouth, okay, adjacent to the mouth. And then this portion is right next to the larynx, and that's where you call it as laryngopharynx. So you have a slide that shows the breakdown of pharynx, but those are the names just to give different locations of it. Anyway, air moves from the nasal to oro to laryngopharynx and then makes its way into the larynx. Epiglottis here is the one that guards larynx when you're swallowing food, drink, mucus, whatever it is. So that's how you can prevent the aspiration of food. Epiglottis acting like a flap that opens and closes. All right, we will learn the details of the larynx more later, but now let's follow the air through the larynx into the trachea. Okay, larynx is made of a bunch of cartilages. Okay, and there are muscles that we will be able to see later in detail. Now, what about trachea? Trachea is again supported by the cartilage. You are looking at C-shaped cartilage here in the front, but nothing in the back. We'll talk about that too. And then it branches off to become bronchi, primary bronchi, the very first branching of the trachea, right and left bronchus. They are the ones that are outside of the lungs. The rest of the branching of the bronchi will all be within the lungs. Primary bronchi become secondary bronchi become tertiary bronchi, then they become smaller and smaller branches. You call that as respiratory tree. It's basically a tree that's upside down, okay? Extensive branching. We look at the branching too in the generations we call from this branching. All of those details will be laid out later. Okay, just to give you some major or basic details of the lungs. Lungs are organized into 3 lobes on the right side and 2 on the left side. All in all, we have 5 lobes. Left lung is a little smaller. You have this notch here, cardiac notch. That is what makes it smaller. This is where the heart sits in that angle. And that's how you have 2 lobes on the left side, 3 lobes on the right side. When primary bronchi becomes secondary bronchi, 1 secondary bronchus occupies each lobe. So you would have 3 secondary bronchi in the right lung, 2 on the left, and they continue to branch. And then you have other names like tertiary bronchi and respiratory bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, etc. Okay, Good. So this is just the overview, and we are also able to see an important muscle that's involved in respiration, diaphragm. Major one, you have to talk about another set of muscles that sit right over the ribs or between the ribs. You call those as the external intercostal muscles. Okay, so those are the two sets of muscles. The external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm are the two key muscles that are involved in breathing all the time. But if there are other types of breathing, like forced breathing, you maybe talk about internal intercostal muscle and other accessory muscles. All right, so let's move on to talk about the detailed version of the respiratory structures. Let's begin with the nose. Nose is partially made of cartilage and then partially by bone. The bone that makes the bony portion is the nasal bone. It's actually paired bone. There are two bones here. The cartilage is what you call as alar cartilage or nasal cartilage. They are like nasal wings. Conchae, we talked about turbinates. They're inside. We saw them before. They are the elevated part, superior, middle, and inferior, based on the location. Okay, so nasal intubation can cause injury to these turbinates. Okay, when you're poking through the nose, you may be hitting against these turbinates, right? Nasal septum is the thin wall that separates the right and left nasal cavities. The floor of the nose is made of palatine bone. You may have heard of hard palate and soft palate. So those are the details. Again, you do not see it here, but we are looking at the different parts of the nose. Mucosa is the lining of the nose. This is the same mucosa that continues throughout the entire respiratory tract. All right, the nature of the cells throughout the mucosa changes, but mucosa is always equipped with goblet cells that secrete mucus. First, you're looking at pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells. Apical portion is where you talk about olfactory epithelium, okay? That is where you have those bipolar neurons serving as olfactory receptors. Okay, so let's trace the pathway of the air, which we did. Air goes through the external nares, nostrils, then the vestibule, the space into the nasal cavity. Air is filtered, humidified, heated to body temperature. This is where you may want to note that general anesthesia can interfere with these functions. There is the dryness, okay, and inspiration of cold, dry air may make you develop sore throat soon after a major surgery. Okay, so now air goes through the internal nares into the nasal pharynx. Okay, these names are familiar to you now. We have seen it in the previous slide and looking at it again now. All right, resistance to airflow through the nasal passageway is twice that of the mouth, you see, and accounts for about 2/3 of the total airway resistance. That's quite a lot of resistance right here in the nasal passageway. Now, another key thing to make a note of is prolonged nasal tracheal intubation could cause obstruction of nasal sinuses, correct? And that could lead to sinus infection and fever. The other sad part about this is because it is in close proximity to the cranium, you may have the sinus infection spread to intracranial infection through the blood vessel arrangements. All right, so just keep in mind that this could happen. Now, innervation of the nose is what is shown. These are the branches of cranial nerve 5, trigeminal. trigeminal cranial nerve has both sensory and motor components in it. It's called a mixed nerve for that reason. So here you're looking at two branches, anterior ethmoidal nerve and maxillary branch. Okay, both one of them is the branch of the ophthalmic nerve. Note that trigeminal nerve gets its name, three branches, right? Three daughters, literally what it means. The three branches are ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular. Okay, so the two branches, the ophthalmic branch and the maxillary branch, give rise to supplies of the nasal parts. Okay, ophthalmic nerve, a branch of the trigeminal nerve, supply anterior third of the septum and the lateral wall. All of this is important to you because you deal with intubation and there could be damage to this nerve, that nerve, and that's why we need to bring it up here. Maxillary branch, a branch of the trigeminal nerve, again, we talked about that already, supplies the posterior 2/3 of the septum and the lateral wall. Nerves to be blocked for tropicalizing nasal airway instrumentation. There you go. So that's another reason why you need to be familiar with these names. You need to sedate these nerves so that when you're intubating, you're not hurting this person.